So just to give you a bit of background, Tim Singleton's head of international news at Sky, but really he's been the center of some of the biggest news stories for the past, dare I say it, 3 decades? 3 decades. And I've known Tim for much of those 3 decades. He took me under his wing when I first started at Calendar News. And of course, he went to great heights. And he's here to tell you some of those things. And I guess, Tim, we can start off really with some kind of, can you give us the latest of what's happening with the American midterms? Because what a night it's been.
Well, look, I'll start with an apology. I usually jump at the chance to visit Leeds in person, given my connections with the city. But when the train strike was announced, I took on some other commitments today. And then when they cancelled the train strike, it was all a bit too much to unpick everything. One of which was a couple of hours ago, a session like this with the NCTJ on mental health and resilience amongst journalists, for which they've just launched a fantastic new resource pack. So that's something else to check out for free, the National Council for the Training of Journalists, who I just spent an hour with virtually a bit earlier today.
Wonderful, and actually one of our colleagues, Jenny Keane, in association with one of our alumni, Abby McClure, were the ones that sort of developed that toolkit. So that was a really important thing that was launched and is in a lot of the newsrooms now. So yeah, thank you for being part of that. I saw you tweet about that just a moment ago. So.
But you're absolutely right. There's a lot of news around, and last night it was the midterms. I must confess I didn't stay up all night and watch all the fantastic Sky News output. There's quite a lot of recording went on and quick checking this morning. But you're right, big story in America, but there's big stories everywhere this year. I've had a variety of calls all around the world this morning. With the different time zones, it's a bit of a challenge. Asia is an early start for me and America's a late finish, but the middle of the day for Leeds is perfect.
Excellent. Well, we're glad that you're here, and actually some of our television broadcasters, our final years, and our MA students are working on their own international program at the moment, so they're really well aware of working with these international time zones. So maybe we'll touch on that in a little bit. But I mean, what a year. I mean, Ukraine, the Queen's funeral, craziness in America that's ongoing, Liz Truss coming and going, etc. I mean, is there a highlight? How are you keeping on top of everything?
Well, I was just thinking back to about a year ago today, and we were just starting to engage in the Ukraine story. But if you fast forward a year, I don't think any of us could have envisaged it would get to this stage with, the kind of threats and issues that we're now talking about in Ukraine, but also everything else that's happened. I guess it's, putting the war aside, it's been a year of 3 prime ministers, 2 monarchs, and we've still got to have 1 World Cup. So there's been a big varied diet of news, and it just feels a bit like that's what the world we're in at the minute. And I remember being a student, probably not really realising quite how seismic things like the Berlin Wall and the Nelson Mandela leaving prison things in sort of 89, 90, and I kind of probably didn't register quite how seismic they were, and maybe that's the case now that when Liz Truss resigned, it was another prime minister's gone, and that's just daily business. And we had, I think, I was trying to do the maths, we had 5 prime ministers, I think, in 30 odd years, and now we've had three in 1 year. It really is extraordinary times to be living in, and as journalists, that's a fantastic privilege for us all, really, to have a go in whatever format and at whatever level to connect those stories to our lives. And all of them really have touched all parts of the UK at all levels, whether that's refugees from Ukraine, whether it's the effects of the monarch's death, whether it's the cost of living crisis, which is of course influenced by the politics of the day. There are so many things that journalists at all levels, in all places, small, large, medium, can get tucked into these days. So it's a fascinating prospect for anyone about to graduate, get into the business. Obviously the issues around recruitment and landing jobs, which we can get onto. But there's in many ways there's never been a more exciting time to be a journalist, in my opinion.
Okay, we'll get into some of those stories in a minute, but just generally, do you think is the appetite for international news growing? Is it receding? Is our ability to cover international news still a priority? Where are we with that?
Well, I can only speak for Sky News and our audience, and media organisations are always focused on their audience and what their established audience is. But the fascinating thing about Sky News is we've got growing audiences on all sorts of different platforms. So what in 30 odd years ago began as the first live TV news channel, here we are sort of 3 decades on, and we're growing at speed in a whole load of other areas and formats. And it's been interesting with the Ukraine war, actually, where those audiences sit, and it's on many different continents, depending on the offer on any given day. But such is the spread of content that Sky News offers. We can have something like a UK showbiz story, which could be top of our app for the most read on a day like today, but at the same time on YouTube, one of our military briefings from Ukraine might be the most watched thing. It's a very eclectic mix, and the audience these days is an international one for Sky News. It's not just in the UK, across many different continents. And for me, as head of international news, that's a great privilege, but also a great challenge, because everyone's interested in everything these days. But ultimately, journalists have to make choices. What stories you cover, what lines you take, what's the top line, what's in your first paragraph, what's lower down the piece. Who do you know? There are choices and judgments to make, and making those is still fundamentally what I have to do day after day.
And when you say that you've got an international audience, are they UK people who happen to be abroad, or do you think that there's a growing sort of international from many nations that are tuning into Sky?
Yeah, it's growing. Obviously depends on the subject interest, but if we do a story from South Asia, we'll often find that there's a big audience in the Philippines, India, places like that. Sky's always had a big connection with Africa because of the traditional way that satellite broadcasting worked, but our South African camera operator was here with his wife last week. She was telling me what a big audience we have in South Africa and how people watch it in all the time, just as a established news provision. We know in America, the Ukraine story particularly has a massive YouTube audience. So it's really fascinating, and part of the challenge for organisations like Sky News is really tracking where that audience is and trying to grow it, and understanding, especially on the digital formats, what are the key things that trigger the audiences and grow their interest. And that's really how you market your content. Content is a word that I never ever heard in the early part of my career, but it's something that's ubiquitous now, and everyone is talking about content. And when you see the difference that phraseology can make on social media, and how that can be the difference between 100 clicks or 1,000 clicks, or whatever the figure is, then our teams here who produce our TikTok, our Twitter, on whatever platform, different techniques for different platforms, and that's very much part of the modern journalistic psyche. Just as in print days, it was all about the headline to draw the viewer in. It's basically the same thing. It's just we're doing it now in many different dimensions every day, on many different formats, which have different types of audiences. If I just give you a flavour, our TV audience is mostly an older profile. On the app, it's mostly UK based. When we get on Apple News, it's mostly UK, but people across the ages. YouTube audiences are predominantly international. And then Snapchat, TikTok and Instagram, it's no surprise, there are younger audiences, but also interestingly tend to have a higher female audience. So that sort of audience segmentation is very much a modern part of modern journalism. And for you guys in jobs, you start working, or even now as you test and model the work you're doing on your courses. That's I expect to be part of what you already do, and will become second nature to you, I think, in a way that for many of us we took audiences a bit for granted, really, and just did our job for 2 or 3 decades. And now a lot of thought goes into how you market your material for which particular audience.
Okay, well, let's dive into some of these stories in a little more depth. So, of course, Ukraine, we've already mentioned it, but that was a big one. We're no longer doing our sort of nightly or morning broadcasts live from a hotel top in Kyiv anymore. But what is happening in terms of the coverage of that? Do you think people are losing interest? You're still there, obviously. You're still doing incredible reporting. Can you talk us through all of those various issues that are associated with covering a war?
Yeah, I mean, it's been very intensive, not without issues, but we're quite proud to say that we've had a reporter in Ukraine for every single day of the war so far, sometimes more than one, currently one. I mean, as you will have noticed, the conflict has gone in sort of different rhythms, has different patterns, different times when different things are a priority. One of the little understood issues is just how vast Ukraine is. It's absolutely huge country, and to travel from the west in Lviv to the as far east as you can go, which is broadly speaking the city of Kharkiv, it's 12 to 15 hour drive, and at the times when the impact of the war was greatest, that could easily be 2 or 3 days. So logistically, it's very challenging. We have to fly into neighbouring countries and then drive in. And so a lot of time is spent just on the infrastructure of supporting our teams, a fantastic team of local drivers, local producers that we have. And what you also need to do is build in resilience and endurance. So you can't just have the same people working all the time for you, given the intensity of what we do. So having the depth and the relationships with our local teams that we have to make sure that all works. Obvious safety issues, whether that's armoured cars, whether it's all the protective equipment we take, the training we do, certainly some of the latest talk about threats, dirty bombs and things like that. We need to make sure that our teams are all trained in the contingencies that we have for all those kinds of situations. So even before you get your notepad out, metaphorically speaking, there's a hell of a lot that goes into supporting an operation in a 21st century sort of ground war in Europe. So it's tough, but some of the journalism we've done, and we hope I don't know whether you'll ever get to see the RTS submission tape for this year's awards, but on that we're just going through the process now of trying to compile our best material, and it's a really difficult job.
Well, actually, you're speaking to one of the judges of the News Channel of the Year, so
there you go.
I will be seeing it.
It's a tough job, and we don't expect any favour or anything else from a robustly and independent judge. But all you need to know, I would say, is that our shortlist of clips are one of the entries. Where we're allowed 10 clips, I think. Our shortlist for clips was 85 long. So it's a tough job, and much anguish and angst is going in the edit suite at the minute as we try and refine the entries. But look, awards come and go, and sometimes you're lucky enough to get them when you haven't put huge amounts of effort in, and then sometimes when you think you're due an award for something, it's very elusive. So the important thing is the relationships we have with our teams, our journalists, our local people on the ground to maintain what we do in very difficult and dangerous times. And I would also add, referring back to the NCTJ issue, that the resilience we need in the team is substantial. And the support that we give people, I won't go into them particularly, but they're quite well chronicled, some of the incidents we've had in Ukraine this year. And it's important that we give our people the support they need and deserve once they're back home. And also for people in edit suites, in production jobs, in the newsroom, there's some quite horrible things coming on agency feeds, particularly, and from Rush's tapes. Not everything makes the final edit for all sorts of reasons, but for people who just watch a lot of that in edit suites, it's important that we give support and we understand what the issues can be for people who spend hours and hours looking at quite difficult things.
And
there's a lot of different dimensions on the resilience front that we have to look at.
I was just going to say that's resilience is a word that we would never have used in the newsroom, 30 years ago. That is something that rightfully has changed, and we are thinking about looking after people and talking about some of the issues that are associated with coverage of things like war reporting. Is it enough? Has it come too late? Are we going in the right direction with that? How do you feel about it?
I think so. I think there's a lot more awareness, and I think with Ukraine, it came off the back of COVID, where everyone had been, a different type of stress and strain, and we went from COVID, where I think a lot of people had refocused on close family relationships, spending a lot of time at home, concentrating on what's really important to you. When, frankly, with the pandemic, we weren't sure what might be taken away from us at very short notice. So that made people focus on work-life balance and the ability to work from home. They were then thrust into a very intense conflict with a lot of difficult issues. And then we had the most well-known incident with our team whose car was shot at in Kiev, and our reporter Stuart Ramsey was shot, and that was quite difficult for the newsroom as a whole to process. And a lot of the attention obviously goes onto the team to bring them out safely and get them the treatment they need. But we also had to look after all the people who work closely with them who it was hard. And this is all happening in mainland Europe. A quick flight away. It's very, very close to us. Which is, I'm very well aware of the debate out there. It's not to say it's more important than other conflicts around the world, but it's just closer. It's more, it had an effect on people, I think, in general, following on from the pandemic, about how vulnerable our lives are. So I think put all that together, and it's definitely a more sophisticated challenge than we've known in previous decades for organisations like Sky News to tackle in relation to their staff.
And if we think back, wars often, there's a characterization of the way news moves on. So, in Iraq, it was the hotel roof war, where correspondents were stood there watching the missiles fly. Is there an emerging characterization of the Ukraine war, do you think, in the way the media is covering it?
Yeah, in the way the media is covering it, I think some of the principles are quite old-fashioned, and at Sky News we value our commitment to eyewitness news. It's a very old-fashioned concept in many ways. You go somewhere, you film it, you send the report home, we broadcast it, and we bring that news into rooms, onto laptops, wherever you consume the news. But I think there's a more fundamental thing there that. And our correspondent Mark Stone in America wrote a piece yesterday about what he's witnessing in the midterms, with this information void where everything's polarized, people believe what they want to believe, stuff that's just not true just gets circulated, retweeted, and people take what they want to believe rather than what is factually true. And therefore, I think in this kind of post-truth agenda, it's even more important than ever before that organisations like Sky remain committed to seeing things for ourselves, to using the eyes of our own journalists, and to bring that news back to our audiences, because I think there is a danger that audiences can just get used to perceived truth rather than absolute truth. And we're in a dangerous territory if journalists stop going out and witnessing things. And I think what we see actually in the modern age is, and propaganda has always been part of war through the ages, but what we see now is a definite attempt to target journalists. The Committee for the Protection of Journalists and other actors are very vocal about this. But journalism is under attack in very many different ways, in different arenas. And it's absolutely right that we stand up for independent, impartial news reporting wherever we can. And, every day I wake up at the minute, there's an issue of that kind that we're confronted with, whether it's Iran, whether it's with Russia, whether it's access to places that we want to go and people don't want us to go, whether it's the different kind of challenge in America. So the trade, even though the means of delivery has changed and there are new ways of reporting and being a journalist, the fundamental concept remains as old as the hills, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. That's something to be proud of.
Okay, Tim, just let's go back maybe just briefly and sort of troll through your resume a little bit, just to give people an idea of where you came from to reach these great heights in your role now. So just give them, so there's some hope that you can go to university here in Leeds and you can end up in a position like yours one day.
Well, I still don't consider myself to be in any great elevated position. I still consider myself a slightly awkward sort of kid who came out of secondary school, not very confident about the world and wanted to be a sports journalist at that point. And the one thing I guess I did have was a bit of at that point a bit of determination and definitely ambition. I've still got all the rejection letters from virtually every daily newspaper in the north of England in my loft, and I ended up taking a job in a very small newspaper in a town in East Yorkshire called Goole, which was where I had to go just to get a job, and I was very thankful to them for giving me a very small newspaper. But that's where I did my thing and did my local reporting and learned the challenges and the rewards of being accountable to your audience. It's talking about the audiences in the modern age. The audience when I started on local papers would be through the front door of the newspaper office haranguing you if you'd spelt their name wrong. So they're good lessons to learn. So I don't regret that for a minute. If anything, I wish I'd spent a bit longer in newspapers learning my trade. I ended up at Yorkshire TV, which is where we met. And then my ambition got the better of me, and I pursued opportunities in London at ITN, which is where I stayed for a long time. But essentially, many of the skills that I learned in the first 2 or 3 years of my career, stay with me now. That's one of the reasons I was pleased to accept the NCTJ invite, because I'm very proud that I managed to pass the NCTJ exam, which if any of you are still studying shorthand, I'm not sure if you do actually.
We do.
You do, very good. That's very heartening. It's a bit like eating all your green veg, isn't it? It's good for you. Not always enjoyable, but it's good for you. And I remember taking my 100 words a minute test and thankfully passing, God knows how. But I'm really proud of that. It's one of the crowning glories of my career. So I think the lessons you learn in the first sort of 5 years of your career, so some of them through adversity, learning that you are going to get turned down, that you are going to struggle, that you are going to lack confidence, that you're not sure whether the boss likes you or not. That's stuff that you will have to go through. I hope that these days employers are a bit more attuned to the feedback issue. I think when we were young journalists, Kath, there wasn't a massive amount of feedback coming in. There was you just got on with it, and people would tell you if there's a problem, but they wouldn't often tell you if you'd done okay, or it didn't have to be great, but just okay. And I think certainly from a Sky perspective, we have a people survey every year, which is basically a survey of all our staff, and what we get back, especially from the younger staff, is this requirement for more feedback. So I think we people like me are still learning that lesson, that just because we didn't get much doesn't mean we can't learn and give more now and be a bit more responsive and have a bit more of a two-way conversation going on. But of course that's difficult in a hurly-burly world, but it's something we need to get better at for sure.
Yeah, and just on that theme about getting your foot through the door, I know that Sky just launched their internship program or placement program. I think I retweeted it. If anyone's following me, you can get the links to it. But just briefly, is that the main way to get some work experience at Sky, do you think?
Yeah, it is, absolutely. So, look, it's been a really frustrating time, and I know my daughter's at university. Her first year was a pandemic year, so I know from family experience just how tough it's been the last couple of years. But one of the effects on for students like you guys is work experience has pretty much been shut down. And that was the case at Sky, but I'm pleased to say that in the last couple of days they've re-announced the reopening of the work experience scheme. That's for all levels, whether pre or postgraduate or whatever. It's out there, so you can find it. And please apply for it. You know, it's a competitive thing. You need to enter it and write a compelling account of why you need to come and do some work experience with Sky. And if you do, just one promise that you look me up when you do, and if you're successful, we'll go and have a coffee. So it's amazing quite often how you do things like this and you meet a student or whatever, and then you find out a year later, or maybe they're working with us, but they've not come and said hello. So one of my learnings from my own work experience sessions back in the day, some of which were catastrophic, was to try and bottle your fear and just try and be engaging and front-footed and try and talk to people. And it can be really intimidating and scary and difficult. Newsrooms aren't always the most hospitable places, but just to, if you can understand that and understand what your issue is, and it was certainly mine that I was just frozen in the spotlight, then perhaps work on some techniques with your lecturers or with your friends or your colleagues about how you might confront those fears and then get the best out of your work experience, because work experience isn't always the easiest thing to navigate. I will mention the other thing is something called the Sky Content Academy, which you can find on the Sky website under the Early Careers tab. And there are various schemes there, usually for graduates, but not exclusively, where you can get involved in a whole array of different Sky opportunities, because obviously Sky is much bigger than Sky News. There's documentaries, there's drama, there's sport, all sorts of things. As I speak to you, I'm sorry, I've got a rather disappointing backdrop that actually the Sky campus is like this amazing university-style place with shops and cafes and restaurants and all sorts. It's a fantastic place to work, and perhaps this backdrop I have isn't conveying the true nature of it, so sorry about that.
We'll let you off. Look, I could talk and ask lots of questions, but I think we'll probably have some questions from our students. So has anyone got a question? Yes. Go ahead, Alex.
Hi.
Hi.
Oh, can you hear me okay?
No.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Just click it at the bottom till it goes green, right screen, and then slide the one up with your thumb.
Okay. Hello.
Hi.
I did an essay on news values last year, and the research I found from a duo called Harkup and O'Neill highlighted that relevancy was the highest news value above all others, trying to get the story out as quickly as possible. Obviously, there are caveats to that, with like keeping it factual, keeping it honest. So how do you, as a broadcaster, balance those news values?
So it just broke up a bit there, but basically you're asking news values, one of which was it relevance?
Yeah,
Relevancy.
the research that I found was that relevancy was the highest one above all others because of social media. Anyone can report anything these days on platforms like Twitter and Facebook and things like that. And it's not always factual. So I was just wondering how, as a big broadcaster like Sky, do you balance those news values by keeping it relevant but also keeping it factual at the same time?
Well, the most important of those is our absolute commitment to accuracy. And it's very, sometimes challenging in a 24-hour news environment, all different formats and products and the thousands of written words that we produce every day on the app or on screen. But accuracy is everything, because we have to maintain the trust of our audience. And in a world where there are all these other actors, as you say, malign or otherwise, absolute accuracy is fundamental. That's a fundamental value. And then the other thing is impartiality. We like to say that Sky has no agenda, and that means impartial broadcasting. And that doesn't mean, well, that does mean no fear or favour, but that doesn't mean you can't analyse as journalists what's going on and use your expertise to say how things are. And that often gets interpreted as opinion, and that's a knife edge we have to tread. But in the UK, we can be very proud that our broadcasting, whether BBC, ITV, Sky News, a couple of others, is impartial. In America and other countries, you don't tend to find that impartiality is honoured that often. And I think we can be very proud in the UK of having a broadcast news industry that you can see those values reflected in. That's not to say that things are always right. It's very important to take ownership of mistakes, and you seem to be accountable and transparent. And I think that's important to keep the trust of the audience. But I think that fundamentally, those are the values that we need to respect. And I think every year there's, correct me if I'm wrong, Kath, but I think it's the Reuters Institute do a trust survey.
Yeah.
And we're always very proud that Sky News comes out at or very near the top of that trust survey. And every day when we start work, that is the thing that we need to protect the most, because it's fundamental to our reputation and therefore our ability to trade in the business of news.
Another question?
Hi Tim, thank you for your time today. I wanted to ask, how would you recommend we, as journalists or cameramen or whatever, how would you prepare for going into somewhere like Ukraine for the first time? If you've never been to anything like that before, how do you get yourself sort of mentally ready for that?
Really good question. So what shouldn't happen is you go from 0 to 100 in one go. So all our teams that we deploy to Ukraine have to have undergone what we call hostile environment training. But training is one thing. There's also a building up of experience and judgment, which comes, I referred to those lessons I learned early on in my career. Some of those lessons last you a lifetime in journalism and are relevant to how you behave in a war zone. So, using your ears, eyes, understanding, is this person telling me the truth? What's their interest in telling me this? All those good journalistic instincts serve you well in a war zone. So ultimately, because of the issues you find in a war zone, that's where the costs can be highest, unfortunately. And that's where, therefore, we need our sharpest, most astute, most aware people. Some of that comes through experience, some of that comes through training. But obviously, there always has to be a first time for someone. And I remember in 1999, I was sent to the border of Albania and Kosovo, which was when NATO was waging war on Serbia. It was because there was a potential genocide in Kosovo. The Serbs were being driven out of Kosovo. And that was my first foreign trip, and I went, but with a very experienced team. So I think we take a lot of care to make sure that our best and most experienced people go to places like Ukraine, but we also recognise that there's an escalator of experience, and for everyone there has to be a first time. We would probably try to ensure that Ukraine isn't the first hostile environment that someone works in. So, for example, you would graduate through maybe things like street protests in the UK, maybe street protests in America, maybe more lower level events, and then ultimately you progress to war reporting. Along that journey, people will find out whether it really is for them or not, whether they like being in hostile crowds, whether they don't mind police, being in proximity to you, whether you get intimidated by the sights and sounds of conflict, and you just grow incrementally like that. So what shouldn't happen is you just go from being very inexperienced to the throes of a war zone. And I think sometimes when freelance journalists tend to send themselves at quite a young age to places, that can be where we get the most jeopardy in situations where they don't have the cocoon of an experienced organisation or an experienced team with them. But that said, there also has to be a realisation that in war, even the most experienced people can get caught out, as happened with my team in Kiev earlier in the year. So experience, training, they're all important, but they're not a passport to anything, and it's important to realise that. Open, I think, is the main maxim. Go into these situations with our eyes wide open. And there's usually someone who wants it so much, wants to be a war from a very early age. That might be tempered by some, well, why do they want that? Is it right? Well, shouldn't they go a bit more slowly and a bit more gradually just to accumulate experience? That's by far the best way.
Anyone else?
Hi Tim, what 3 skills or traits would you look for in one of our students coming to you for a placement or work experience?
Wow, good question. 3 skills. 1, be interested. Be interested. And funnily enough, I'll tell this story against myself. I was doing some early shifts at Yorkshire Television as a freelance. And I came and did my thing, and then I got up to go at about 5 p.m. And the person in charge said, well, aren't you staying for the programme? And I thought, well, no, I've got nothing left to do. And they sort of raised their eyebrows. But of course, it must have looked very odd. I'd gone in to learn the art of theatre. I wasn't hanging around to watch the programme go out. So lesson 1, be interested, or skill 1, be interested in the product that's being produced. And it sounds odd. It's funnily enough, it's one of those things. And related to that is go to either the interview or the work experience with work done. So, I did an interview last week with someone who, or a couple of weeks ago, and said, what do you most like about the Sky app? And I said, I haven't really seen much on it. And it's that interest level, at least do your homework. So lesson 1 is be interested in the product. Skills 2 is be helpful. And that's related to what I said at the start about being as front-footed as you can be. Be helpful. The best thing that you can do, or the best thing at the end of your work experience that can happen is for the team you've been with to say a day or a week later, God, we really miss so-and-so, they were really helpful, they were really useful. So, and that can be hard because you think you're surrounded by all these professionals who know everything and they've been doing it for years and they know everything. Trust me, we don't. There's only so much information a mind like mine can consume, and especially in the modern age, I haven't seen everything. So if we're not covering something, it's not because we're brilliant at judgment and we know everything, it's probably we just haven't seen it. So it would amaze you how easy it is to say, hey, Tim, have you seen this story on page 32 of the Guardian? It's really interesting. I probably won't have. So that's the second thing, be helpful. So do your homework, be helpful. What do you need? A third one. Be committed. Be committed. Be committed and throw everything in and try and make an impact. And that's not guaranteed that you'll be able to, or the circumstances will be helpful, but at least go and give it your best shot. And again, I say that from personal experience. I left a regional newspaper in the north of England after 3 days just because everyone was ignoring me and I didn't feel wanted or anything. I probably didn't show the requisite level of determination or ability to think I'll show them and just come in with a story idea the next day. But these are all learnings. None of us, even at my relatively advanced age, know everything. So these are just things you learn. But from my experience, you're going into work experience, give yourself the best shot of A, enjoying it, B, it being fruitful, and C, the people you're with thinking at the end of it, crikey, they were interesting, they were interested, they were engaged, they were engaging, and give yourself a chance.
Hi Tim. How much of an active role do you take in the development of your journalists in your current position?
I think that was, what active role do I take in the development
Yeah,
of
how
my
much
journalists?
of an active role do you take in the development of your journalists in your current position?
Yeah, so every journalist at Sky News has a line manager. I line manage about 25 people. We have regular check-ins, feedback. We have a once a year performance chat, but that is off the back of more regular check-ins through the day. I also am privileged to be able to recruit into roles, and I think this year we've recruited some really interesting people. Yusrael Bagir, our new Africa correspondent, Helen Ann Smith, our new China correspondent, Martha Kellner, who you may be aware of. She's from your part of the world. She's from Wakefield. We sent her to America just on a 6-month cover opportunity about a year ago, and she's now, a year later, has just been appointed our LA correspondent, and as I speak is in Florida haranguing ex-President Trump. If you look her up on the app, if you get a minute after this, you'll see how she was the only UK broadcast journalist at Trump's press conference yesterday and managed to get a conversation. I think for me that's one of the more rewarding aspects. People opportunity and flourish, but also still supporting them as they go through. And in different parts of the world with different challenges, people do need support. So an active role in support and development, I would like to think.
Hi Tim, my question's a bit of a two-parter. Since the growth of social media for the past few years, have you seen an increase in the interest of young people with international news? And how important do you think it is for young people to engage with international news?
Fundamentally important, because take the second one first, because the world's a much smaller place than it used to be, and on all sorts of issues you can see how they affect us. I mentioned this at the start, things like migration. The world's problems are much closer to us than we think. And actually I took a 3-year sort of sojourn from journalism and worked at the Department for International Development as Director of Communications, and actually you realise in a role like that quite how connected all the world's issues are. Climate change, population, all linked to migration, economic disparities. All these connections bring stories to our door. So fundamentally important that we recognise what's going on in the world and try and make sense of it. And it's disappointing, really, frankly, that some issues just in many parts of our media are never fully explained through. Migration, I think, is a stunted debate. I think climate change often doesn't address some primary issues. The world will go through the 8 billion population barrier next Tuesday. 8 billion people in our world. And that pressure on resources is related to climate change, but you don't see those issues reported much. So I think if we can breed a new generation of journalists who are engaged in international issues and who want to keep them at the forefront of our media, that's really, really important. And unfortunately, in the fractured world we're in at the minute, especially when people are fearful, they tend to look primarily at what hurts them or what affects them, very understandably. Cost of living, family, healthcare, and people get introverted. But the risk of that is we take our eye off the real drivers of things that are happening in our world. Second, do I see increased interest in it? I'm not sure about that, actually. It's very, very hard to know, but my door is not knocked down by people wanting to get involved. I have to be honest. And I don't know whether that's because everything is now done from behind the curtain of social media or computers, laptops, phones, whatever, and that creates an obstacle. It should make life easier, but perhaps it doesn't. So I think I would always encourage more people to approach directly. It's not to say I can give a job every day or whatever, but I'll always try and engage with someone who approaches us, give advice, give areas of interest. I like to try and do that, but I don't. There's not a massive queue at the door.
Have we got time for one more question? No questions? Oh, we've got one more question.
Hi, I just wanted to ask about who inspired you to become the person that you are today?
Wow. I will say who inspired me. I wanted to be a sports journalist first of all, and there was a chap called David Lacey, who was an old sports writer in The Guardian, and I fixated on 2 or 3 people whose craft I followed in sport, and then in foreign affairs journalism, people you look out for and read and latch onto. So I would say that in terms of the professional thing, and then I think I wouldn't say inspired, but for me, people who gave me confidence. And there's a range of people in leadership positions through the years who I could point to, who trusted me and obviously felt that I was doing a good job for them. And I guess the lesson of that is it's networking in a sense. It's who you can forge relationships with, who will help you develop your career. And you create these links with people. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to do that in different places. But I mean, in this day and age, you'd probably call that mentoring, although I didn't realise it at the time. So I won't give you one name or one person, but there were various people at stages of my career who trusted me. And if you can find someone who you can build that relationship with, they're the people who will then give you the inspiration. But look, we're all different. I was a slightly unconfident, gawky teenager who needed people to believe in me. And luckily enough, that happened. But I very much hope you guys can achieve that too. And I know, Kath, and the work I've seen go on at where you're studying is equipping you with all that to a much greater degree than I was equipped when I went into the workplace. So from where I'm sat, you're all in a very good position. It's just about taking the next step and forging those connections in the workplace.
Well, I think we'll take that as a good place to end on that. Thank you so much, Tim, and a round of applause, please.